In 1314, Edward II of England famously suffered an embarrassing defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, inflicted upon him by Robert the Bruce. But the English defeat at Bannockburn was no bolt from the blue, and should have been of no real shock to anyone in England at the time, including even the hapless English king himself. Emboldened by the death of the mighty Edward I in 1307, Robert the Bruce and his fellow Scots posed an increasingly menacing threat to the English north in the early years of the reign of Edward II. Robert had talented men in his service, like James the Black Douglas. The King of Scots was further aided in his quest to throw off the shackles of English oppression by Edward II's somewhat bizarre fascination with Piers Gaveston. The Lanercost Chronicle relates how Robert the Bruce invaded the north of England in 1311, telling us how Robert took advantage of the disunity that Edward had sown in England with his excessive fondness of Gaveston. The Chronicle says, the said Robert then, taking note that the king and all the nobles of the realm of England were in such distant parts and in such discord about the said accursed individual, Piers Gaveston, having collected a large army, invaded England by the Solway on Thursday before the feast of the Assumption of the Glorious Virgin, August the 12th, 1311. According to the Chronicle, Robert's campaign lasted little more than a week, and although the Scots helped themselves to a great many cattle and burned several towns, the Scottish king avoided unnecessary shedding of human blood, only killing those who stood in his way. This, then, was a very stark warning to Edward II. Bruce was essentially telling his English counterpart that he was powerless to stop him. The previous year of 1310, Edward had led a farcical campaign into Scotland, where he was hopelessly outwitted by Bruce. The Vita Edwardi Secundi describes what happened. The king entered Scotland with his army, but not a rebel was to be found. At that time, Robert Bruce, who lurked continually in hiding, did them all the injury he could. One day, when some English and Welsh, always ready for plunder, had gone out on a raid, accompanied by many horsemen from the army, Robert Bruce's men, who had been concealed in caves and woodland, made a serious attack on our men. From such ambushes, our men suffered heavy losses. The Vita Edwardi Secundi describes Bruce's employment of guerrilla warfare as almost an act of cowardice, but for the King of Scots it made perfect sense. Against Edward I, the Scots had found the English to be a formidable enemy when facing them in pitched battle, especially when the English were led by the old king himself. So why then should the Scots run the risk of pitched battle when the odds were not favourable to them? And Robert would have calculated pretty quickly that Edward II was of absolutely no equal to the exceptional abilities of his father, and that in all likelihood the new King of England would struggle to counteract Robert's tactics, as he was devoid of even a merely competent military brain. For the English, the Scots' tactics may have been cowardice, but for the Bruce, they were common sense. Writing to the Pope after this shambolic campaign of 1310, Edward II said despairingly, Robert Bruce and his accomplices, when lately we went into parts of Scotland to repress their rebellion, concealed themselves in secret places after the manner of foxes. But for Edward, the disasters he suffered in Scotland, of which there would be a number, with Bannockburn being the low point, he had more pressing priorities in England, namely maintaining his bond with Piers Gaveston in the face of increasing hostility from his nobles. In the years leading up to the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert continued to plague the English north. For the English living in the very northernmost parts of the country, closest to the Scottish borders, attempts at truces were made, although this came at the natural risk of angering Edward himself, disgusted at his subjects making peace with the enemy. But truces or not, Scottish raids would continue. In 1312, the Lanercost Chronicle relates how Bruce marched on Lanercost Abbey itself in Cumbria, with the Chronicle stating Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, came with a great army in the month of August to the monastery of Lanercost and remained there for 3 days, making many of the canons prisoners and doing an infinity of injury. But at last the canons were set at liberty by himself. The crisis between Edward II, Piers Gaveston, and the barons had reached boiling point, ending with the violent death of Gaveston only a couple of months earlier. So it was little wonder then that the threat of the Scots had gone largely unchecked, even after Gaveston's murder. Bruce would go on to sack Hexham, Corbridge, and elsewhere, taking prisoners and looting as he went before the Scots raided further still, extracting financial tribute from the people of Durham. The north of England was effectively at Bruce's mercy, and he now turned his attention to the border town of Berwick, although his efforts here proved futile. According to the Lanercost Chronicle, Bruce was all set to launch a raid that would surely have captured Berwick, but was foiled ultimately by a dog whose barking alerted Berwick's defenders. Although Berwick had failed, Bruce must by now surely have been confident in his ability to crush English interference in Scotland for good, ending their unwelcome presence in the country that had been started by Edward I. Bruce had all the ingredients for victory in his hands: brave and fierce Scottish commanders, his own ingenuity, and complete chaos in Edward's realm. Whilst Bruce had to contend with his own problems at home, they were nothing in comparison to the self inflicted acts of stupidity committed by Edward II, and in the summer of 1314, Bruce would face Edward II in open battle and deal him the most crushing of defeats, sending the King of England into a humiliating retreat. Whilst this didn't end Edward II's efforts to regain control of Scotland, Robert the Bruce had set the Scots on a path to a centuries long independence.